Hello, everybody. This is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association in New York. And today we are pleased, honored, and stimulated to have Reid Brophy from Human Rights Watch, who's been following the International Criminal Court proceedings and the proceedings to set up the International Criminal Court for as long as I have, which is right from the beginning. At the UN, at the time of the ICC, it was mostly Bosnia, bit of Sudan, bit of Darfur, and everybody was chorusing, never again, never again. So now, all these years later, again and again and again. But those of us who forced to take the long view by a proximity to the United Nations and international justice, some of us are actually quite surprised by how much progress has been made. And the idea that Benjamin Netanyahu is now possibly headed to the dock, despite all of the obstacles put up there, is a very gratifying one. It was a bit like when General Pinochet was arraigned. He might have got off, but the fact that he was held was a big advance. And just throwing an anecdote, I remember being in Germany at a conference, and an American Foreign Service officer was frothing, literally, he'd had a few drinks, at the temerity of the French, who had arrested Henry Kissinger under a universal warrant. They let him go after lots of phone calls from the White House, but, you know, nobody could get as indignant as Henry Kissinger. And when he was arrested in Paris, his indignation knew no bounds, but he didn't advertise it, which was interesting. So what is the position with the International Criminal Court? Maybe, Reid, you could give us a quick blowdown. I mean, who are the parties? What can we reasonably expect from it? Is Netanyahu going to end up in handcuffs in the dock?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ian, and welcome everybody. I am speaking to you from the conference center in The Hague, where there is the annual Assembly of States Parties of the ICC, the 125 now countries who meet every year. First of all, let me also say, Ian, that I'm not at Human Rights. I was at Human Rights Watch for 20-something years, but I'm actually not at Human Rights Watch now.
Okay, emeritus.
I'm at emeritus. I'm at the International Commission of Jurists. I have a bunch of other titles. I'm on a UN Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights in Nicaragua and other things. Anyway, so we're here at the annual meeting, and it actually seems much more consequential than usual. Monday, in her opening speech, the ICC president, a Japanese judge, talked about a turning point in history, and particularly the existential threat of sanctions from the United States, as if the court, she said, were a terrorist organization. And how we got here then goes to the title of the talk, which is this is all, of course, because of the ICC's arrest warrants issued last month for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, as well as for a Hamas leader who is actually presumed to be dead. This was really, a watershed event in international justice. I mean, it's the first time in the ICC's 22 years that a warrant has been issued against a U.S. ally, and in fact, it's the first time that any international court, in modern history, or in history perhaps, has issued a warrant for a U.S. ally. I think the history of international justice has been that the instruments are almost exclusively used either against vanquished enemies, as in the Nuremberg trial and the Tokyo trial, against powerless, usually Africans or outcasts, or against adversaries of the West, and like Slobodan Milosevic, and last 2 years ago against Vladimir Putin. And so, this came really as a thunderbolt. I mean, it was a slow motion thunderbolt, but and that's what has really put this meeting, has set the stage for this meeting. In the case, it's also been a long time that the Palestinians have attempted to invoke the International Criminal Court for war crimes. Since actually, it's been 16 years since the 2008 CAST-led operation, which left more than 1,400 Gazans killed, but also for things like prohibited settlements on the West Bank, apartheid, collective punishments. And these complaints had really gotten the slow walk for 15 years from 3 successive ICC prosecutors, from Luis Moreno Ocampo, from Fatou Bensouda, and for the beginning, from the current prosecutor Karim Khan. And it was always the Israel situation was always the exhibit A in the double standards of the ICC and international justice. I mean, most of my work has been in Latin America and in Africa in particular. And I would always hear, well, it's great, Reed, that you're going after, this African dictator or this Latin American here, but what about people talk about George Bush, but people would particularly talk about what was going on with the Palestinians and Israel. And even last year at the Assembly of States Parties, which was held at the UN in New York, 2 months after October 7th, we all came away with the feeling that even in the face of what Israel was already doing, that Karim Khan, the prosecutor, a very politically astute British barrister, who had been elected with American, and even though the U.S. is not a party to the ICC, had been elected with very strong UK and US support, was never actually going to cross the line and seek any action against Israeli officials. And maybe we were wrong. I think it may have been that the relentless Israeli assault. I think also the growing international condemnation, particularly bolstered by the other court in The Hague, the International Court of Justice, which, in response to a complaint, the case by South Africa, found that Israeli actions created a plausible risk of genocide. I think it may have just become untenable for the prosecutor not to act. And so last May, and this May, he announced publicly that he had requested warrants for the 2 Israeli officials, as well as for the 3 Hamas leaders.
Could we just take a pause
Sure.
to disambiguate for people? Because there's 3 separate concepts hovering around. There's the International Court of Justice, which adjudicates cases between states. Then there's the International Criminal Court of Justice. But also hovering in the background is the doctrine of universal jurisdiction, which Israeli officials have fallen foul of in the past. I mean, the British have gone onto planes at Heathrow and warned people, Israeli officials, to get off and go back because they're subject to an arrest warrant under the presumed international law is bloody murderers are not allowed into the country. Could you explain the differences?
Sure. Well, so I mean, you have explained it well. I mean, there are different, as you say, the ICJ is a state-to-state, or mostly a state-to-state court. It's the highest judicial organ of the UN. Um, the ICC is one branch of international criminal justice. Another major branch, there's an entire ecosystem. You have hybrid courts now, you have regional courts, you have international investigatory mechanisms particularly on Myanmar and on Syria. But you also have, and that's how General Pinochet was arrested. And interestingly, all of this began really in 1998. Was in July, the ICC the Statute of Rome was adopted, and then in October of that year, General Pinochet was arrested. A Chilean dictator, a Chilean former president, arrested in London on a warrant from a Spanish judge for crimes allegedly committed in Chile. And that was under this notion of universal jurisdiction, which is that all states have the right, and in some cases under treaty laws, the obligation to arrest or to prosecute, to prosecute or to extradite perpetrators of international crimes if they're on their territory. And interestingly, going back to what I was talking about before, we've also seen, and you alluded to it, Ian, this double standard in terms of in terms of universal jurisdiction. So, in fact, my Palestinian, Raji Sourani, who's one of the leading Palestinian lawyers, and who's here at the ICC assembly, said he has personally been involved in having 6 laws repealed, because as you talked about at the UK, each time an Israeli official went to a Western country and the Palestinians filed a complaint, in many cases the law was repealed. So and we saw, I mean, I was very involved in cases in both Belgium and Spain, which used to have the widest laws on universal jurisdiction in the world. The Belgian law was very useful for prosecuting first alleged Rwandan genocidaires. My case, a case I worked on, the Hissène Habré case, was there. But when case was filed first against Ariel Sharon, and then in particular against George Bush father, I was in Belgium when Donald Rumsfeld came to Belgium and said, if NATO officials cannot come to Belgium without worrying about this ridiculous law, then we're going to have to move NATO out of Brussels. And the law caved in like a house of cards. And Spain, the Spanish law under which Pinochet was being prosecuted, and which has prosecuted a number of people from El Salvador and Guatemala and Argentina, also crumbled when cases were brought relating to Chinese, Israeli, and American officials. So we've seen this double standard, throughout international justice, and that's the context here for these warrants. All of a sudden, for the first time in modern, history, you have Western or pro-Western ally or Western ally be indicted, and that was back in May. And usually these indictments, I mean, in the case of Russia and Vladimir Putin, which actually had not been announced, usually the prosecutor does not even announce the indictments, and we believe that one of the reasons he announced the indictments was to get rid of the pressure that was on him. As a couple of days after he issued the warrants, actually, The Guardian and 2 Israeli-based publications revealed that the Israeli government over the course of 9 years, had deployed its intelligence agencies to surveil, hack, pressure, smear senior ICC staff in an effort to derail their inquiries. And that Mossad director Yossi Cohen had been spying on phone calls made by the previous prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. They had approached her at her home, at her private home, with an envelope of cash. They threatened her and her family, mafia style.
Nothing subtle there.
Nothing subtle. No, really. They allegedly threatened her, saying, you shouldn't be getting into things that could compromise your security and that of your family. They reportedly mounted a sting operation against her husband. They enlisted DRC President Joseph Kabila in efforts to extort her. And so, this was the prosecutor makes his announcement. And then that was 6 months ago. And in those 6 months, I mean, we don't know all the things that have happened. Two of the three judges, because the prosecutor sought the arrest warrant from a pretrial chamber of three judges. Two of those judges have stepped aside. One because the Mexican judge, because her husband was in the deputy foreign minister in Mexico, had been one of the countries that referred the case to the ICC, but also a Romanian judge who was the head of the chamber, who stepped aside for health reasons, but is still working on other cases. So we don't know what kind of pressure was being brought. And there was a feeling, is this ever going to happen? And then finally, a couple of weeks ago on November 21st, we got the announcement that the warrants had been issued, that the judges found that there was reasonable grounds to believe that the Israeli leaders, and I'll talk about the Israelis more than about Hamas, although obviously these two cases move forward in parallel, and I don't want anything I say here to suggest that what Hamas did on October 7th was anything other than a despicable crime against humanity. But of course, all three of the Hamas people who were targeted by warrants have been killed by Israel. So what happens now? I don't think actually, that Benjamin Netanyahu is going to anytime soon find himself in the dock. I think we need to be lucid about this. The International Criminal Court has never, and this is something that they don't advertise, but in 22 years, the International Criminal Court has never apprehended, prosecuted, and convicted a state official anywhere of any country, anywhere in the world, because the ICC depends on state cooperation. It doesn't have, of course, a police force. And whether it's Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, they are, and we'll talk about that probably soon, but they are not, nobody's going to go in and take them out. But it's obviously a major concern to Israel. It's a major blow. I think cements the consensus internationally around the criminal nature of Israel's response to the atrocities. I think it certainly labels Netanyahu, like Vladimir Putin, like Omar al-Bashir, an accused war criminal. It limits, and we'll talk about that, his travel. I mean, all 125 ICC member states have the legal obligation to to cooperate with the court, which means to arrest him and to transfer him to the court if he goes there. I should say that other states also, under things like the Geneva Conventions, have an obligation to arrest or extradite accused war criminals, but leaving it to ICC member states. But I mean, particularly what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, and this is the backdrop for a lot of the president of the court statement that I mentioned earlier, is the inevitability of U.S. sanctions against the court. You will recall that in September 2020, in the waning days of the first Trump administration, by executive order, he placed sanctions on the previous prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, for having an investigation into American soldiers, into potential American crimes in Afghanistan, as well as for the investigation that she was conducting into Israel and Palestine. And there were two officials, a South African official at the court was named. Those sanctions were lifted immediately by the Biden administration. But this May, when the prosecutor announced he was seeking the warrants for the Israeli officials, the Republicans in Congress presented new legislation for sanctions, and that legislation was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives. It's broader and wider than the sanctions, the Trump sanctions. It requires financial penalties for ICC investigators. It requires the U.S. government to impose asset freezes and visa bans on foreign persons who assist in any way in ICC investigations. So that includes, I'm an American citizen, but if I weren't, it could include people like me. In fact, it could include me because I have dual nationality, theoretically. But
we have been here before, haven't we? When John Bolton came in and
right.
immediately sort of arranged a whole set of bilaterals with weak countries and coral atolls and told them they had to sign on for this or else. And I mean, apart from making him look rather petty and silly, did that have much effect?
Well, those laws ultimately, and you're talking about what are referred to as Article 98 agreements, where the U.S. bilaterally got all these countries, particularly smaller, weaker countries, to sign treaties with the U.S. saying that they would not hand over people to the ICC, Americans to the ICC, which, of course, I mean, it's not like the Bahamas. The U.S. basically, for instance, for the Bahamas, the U.S. said, we're not going to give you money for this airport unless you sign this Article 98 agreement that would say that you will never arrest an American. And of course, there were never, as it turns out, and still today, have not been any Americans being sought by the ICC. The thing about the sanctions today and what people are freaking out about, I mean, literally here in The Hague, is that these sanctions will, let's say, basically shut down the ICC. That individuals, I have a friend who works at the ICC who's a European who was planning to take vacation in the United States, is not doing it. But worse than that, I mean, for instance, the U.S. sanctions Microsoft for doing business with the ICC. The ICC shuts down because it relies on Microsoft.
Well, it shouldn't. So,
and these are, I mean, as the president of the court said, these sanctions are as if the ICC were a terrorist organization, and it requires the same. I mean, we don't know. So what I was talking about before was the legislation that is sitting in Congress today. We don't know what Donald Trump is going to do on January 20th, whether he will issue an executive order that will sanction everybody at the ICC, that will sanction anybody who does business with the ICC. I was just in a meeting with NGOs, European NGOs, who are trying to figure out if they're supplier of computers, if they're supplier of this, because they are cooperating, they are assisting the ICC. So that's really a big worry here.
Are there any suggested counter leverage, like if other countries said, well, if you're going to do that, we are not going to honor any American extradition requests from now on, full stop?
Well, I think people are looking at I mean, there is a lot of energy here going into how to get ahead of U.S. sanctions. A number of countries have what are they called? Sanction and I think anti-sanction. I forget the technical word for them. But basically, which would alleviate, which would tell their company or their bank, basically the countries would be forced to, of course, they're called blocking statutes, but basically countries would be then forced to choose whether they comply with U.S. sanctions, or and face penalties in their home country. But there's also, yes, I mean, a number of countries also, for instance, there are a lot of cases in the ICC, or pretty much every other case at the ICC that the U.S. likes. So Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine probably doesn't have the leverage to tell the U.S. what to do. But of course, if the ICC gets wiped out, the case against Vladimir Putin also gets wiped out. And so there is a lot of talk here about other states challenging what the U.S. is doing. And there is a lot of support. I mean, the EU gave a statement on, I think it was yesterday, ironically delivered by Hungary, which is the chair
Yes. One of your passports.
condemning threats of sanctions against the ICC, calling on the members to adhere to their obligations to execute outstanding warrants. And also, I should also mention that you're not supposed to also, the EU has a law that says that you should avoid non-essential contacts with suspects under arrest warrants. But we've also seen a very mixed reaction. I mean, France, which is really, one of the founders of the court and one of the main backers of the court, has, last week gave this very ambiguous, or worse than ambiguous statement, talking about potential immunities that Netanyahu would enjoy, which is totally not what they said about Vladimir Putin. I mean, there is an issue, there's a legal issue, which is, does Israel is not a member of the ICC. There was, or I mean, an argument can be made that the head of government or head of state of a non-member of the ICC should continue to have immunity, despite the ICC's rejection of immunities. That was always that was the U.S. position until Vladimir Putin was indicted. And of course, Russia is also a non-state party to the ICC. So there's a lot we're seeing. I mean, it's interesting because I would say up until November 21st and the warrants, the double standards were manifest at the ICC itself, that it was going after these countries and not those countries, and these leaders and not those leaders. And now we're seeing that being transferred to the states. Countries that applauded warrants against these people are looking a different way at the warrants, at these warrants. And I think it's fair to say that between one and particularly the sanctions, at the moment the court is fighting for its life. I mean, earlier today, I was at a meeting with the prosecutor who said, that is this going to be, the end of international law? And will countries, will the U.S., he didn't use the name, nobody mentions countries here, but are people going to stop at the ICC? What about the International Court of Justice? What about the European Court of Human Rights? I mean, can international law, and I would say, can international law survive even-handedness? I mean, this to many of us, the warrants against the Israeli officials were the first time that we saw that the court could act against the Western, powerful countries, and maybe ultimately the traffic doesn't bear that, and we were wrong to place our faith in these things.
Well, part of this is that the ICC provisions are only supposed to kick in when the domestic courts have failed to deliver justice. And this, of course, is the judgment call, because everybody knows the Israelis are wonderful, nice, law-abiding, civilized people who are humane, the most humane army in the world. Ignore the blood on the hands, ignore the bombs and the bomb craters and devastation of Gaza. That's what's fixed in people's mind, a lot of people's minds still, even after all of this time. So when you have the when you have the court doing it, how did the court get round the idea that the Israeli courts were ineffective, when a lot of Westerners think that the Israeli courts are paragons of justice and virtue?
Well, that's a very important question, and it's certainly one of the things that the U.S. And Israel have put forward. The fact, and yes, the court is a subsidiary court. Its jurisdiction is under the principle of complementarity. Only kicks in when the national court is unwilling or unable to investigate a situation. It's a court of last resort. Now, the question is not whether Israel has a good justice system, which can be debated, but certainly it is in many, I mean, for many people.
Well, if you're Benjamin Netanyahu, you got lots of defenses. If you're Abdullah in the Gaza, no.
Right. Well, no, but the question is not in the abstract whether Israel has a good justice system. The question is Israel investigating Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes? And there the answer is no. And that is the only test. And Israel has claimed that actually Israel filed motions. The first time Israel has ever filed actually motions before the International Criminal Court, has said, you haven't given us a chance to investigate. You've gone too quickly. The prosecutor said, well, I've had this case open since before October 7th. I've been investigating you guys, and you know this, since at least 2021, when a formal investigation was open. Israel still has that opportunity. Israel still has the opportunity to open a real, it can't be a sham investigation. They actually have to be investigating in a real way. And they do have the judiciary that would allow them potentially to make that argument, but they would have to actually do that. It's not just enough to say we're a democratic country, we have lifetime tenure.
They did. I mean, give them the due. They did do this in the case of Ariel Sharon and Lebanon, up to some extent, didn't they?
That is correct. I mean, that is correct. They did invest. This was, of course, 1982. But yes, they did investigate Ariel Sharon for the massacres in the refugee camp.
But he had the Hamas defense. He was dead by then.
I mean, so it is potentially possible. I mean, the reports I've seen from Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem and others showed that even routine investigations of potential war crimes by Israeli soldiers do not move forward. But yes, this is a potential thing that Israel could say. And the court is very deferential to state actors. But so far, and this has been talked about a lot in Israel. And the first prosecutor, Luis Moreno Campo, keeps saying, well, Israel could just get out of this by doing an investigation. I don't know if it's that easy, but it certainly is an avenue that's open to them.
And going forward, I mean, what would it take for them to really prove good intent? I mean, it's obvious from outside. It's not just a statistical thing, but I don't think you can find a single IDF personnel who's been prosecuted for outrageous crimes, caught on television, witnessed and confessed.
Right. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to wade into something here. But yes, I mean, that's been my understanding, that even as you say, people who've been caught on video and others have not actually been successfully prosecuted.
And statistically speaking, I don't think you're going to find a sort of 1C directive from Netanyahu saying, kill any journalists you see with Al Jazeera on. But let's say a statistically significant number of Al Jazeera journalists have been shot in action.
Sure. Again, sure. As you say, I don't know that journalists have been targeted, but many have been killed out from Al Jazeera and from other media. I mean, I think I think, look, no matter what one thinks of the Israelo-Palestinian conflict, no matter what one thinks about Netanyahu and Hamas, I mean, it's really hard to look at even from where we're sitting and watch what is happening in Gaza and feel that this comports with the laws of war. Now it's interesting that the indictments that were put forward were mostly put forward and that were issued were mostly for the use of humanitarian, for the prevention of humanitarian aid, for the use of starvation as a war crime. There are many other, and as a crime against humanity, there are many other potential crimes and such as attacking. So let me step back. The basic rule of the laws of war. There are couple of basic rules. The first one is distinction between civilian objects and military objects. Military people, soldiers, military objects are fair targets. Civilians and civilian objects are not. Even when you attack second rule is proportionality. Even when you attack a military target, you have to do so in a way that is not disproportionate, in which the loss of civilian life and infrastructure is not disproportionate to the anticipated concrete military advantage. Obviously, Hamas is, using human shields. They are putting their soldiers, their fighters in places that make civilian targets, and those itself are war crimes. But it doesn't.
The IDF has personnel in the middle of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and in Ramla and all of the other places along the coast there. So Hamas.
That's true, but they're not being targeted. But that's not the theater of operations. Anyway, those things are much harder. It's interesting because the prosecutor also requested, among the crimes that the prosecutor enumerated, because we haven't seen the warrants. We've only seen a press release from the prosecutor and a press release from the court. The actual request for the warrants and the actual warrants have never been made public, so I don't exactly know what's in them. But interestingly, the prosecutor also charged the two Israeli officials with intentionally attacking civilian arms. And the court said in its decision that in only two of the instances could they did they find that they find that the proof existed that civilian are, of indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks on civilians, because those are notoriously difficult to prove, and that's why it was what I was saying before. Why I think the prosecutor went to things like starvation, which were matters of state policy, very similar to what the prosecutor did with Vladimir Putin. So Vladimir Putin was not indicted for Bucha or Mariupol or things that require you to look at the chain of command, to look at whether civilians were there, to think about what the leaders knew, to think about these things. He was indicted for the taking of children, which for the deportation of Ukrainian children from Ukraine to Russia, which was something that he embraced. He said, "This is my policy. I am doing this." And it makes it easier for people outside who don't have access all the way, and who don't have access to what your intent is, to issue an indictment. And that's the same thing, more or less, what has happened here. We understand that the prosecutor has not, in fact, in the Russia instance, he then went on later, a year later, to indict military officials for attacks on civilian objects. And we understand the prosecutor may have other things up his sleeve in this situation too. But basically, he tried to focus on things that could be hung on the leadership as matters of state policy.
Just casting back earlier, because he's in the early days of Gaza, there was an inquiry by somebody who a lot of us revered and looked up to, Judge Arthur Goldstone. I interviewed him several times, and I was always tremendously impressed by him and his integrity. And then he folded and disappeared. And I understand the pressure he was on. I mean, basically, the whole pro-Israeli community, let's just say, in South Africa, basically said they were going to shun him if he carried on. And in the end, he sort of he withdrew from it, and a somewhat unconvincing withdrawal of his original complaint. Is he still around? Does he have any?
Richard Goldstein, I think he's here. I saw him I saw his name on a panel, and he was the. So yes, I mean, I don't have the granular knowledge to speak about that. I mean, he did chair this UN inquiry into the CAST-led operation in Gaza that I talked about earlier. And that inquiry found that both sides, Hamas and particularly Israel, had committed serious crimes. And then, as you say, he backtracked, and I'm not, I can't.
Oh, it's okay. It's unfair to throw it onto you.
But no, he's still. In fact, he was attached to a very a couple of years ago. There was a major, and I want to say that I know Richard Goldstone. I've spent time with him. He's somebody I admire, and from my own personal knowledge, I have only admiration for him. So I don't know enough about the issue. But a couple of years ago, he chaired a very important inquiry into a review of the ICC's functioning. I mean, the ICC has a lot of problems other than the ones that we've talked about. First of all, I mentioned that in 22 years, they have never, and well over $2 billion spent. The ICC has only 6. I mean, if you go to the website, it's very misleading, because you go to the website, I think it talks about 12 convictions. And 5 of those were convictions for witness tampering and obstruction of justice. So there are only 7 convictions for
primary convictions, you might say.
For international crimes. One of those was of a state leader, Laurent Gbagbo of Cote d'Ivoire, which was which folded on appeal, and the other 6 are convictions of rebels. So that's a big problem. Today, they're very worried here. I've heard the word empty courtrooms, mentioned many times here or several times here in these 3 days. They have no defendants waiting for trial. They have 30 warrants out there. Or 30 public, I think 31 public warrants that have not been executed. There may be secret warrants as well, and they're worried about empty courtrooms. The prosecutor himself is facing allegations of sexual harassment that have been mishandled from the beginning, and there's a lot of talk about now, I mean, there will be some kind of independent investigation into that. There is repeatedly, and one of the things that the Review Commission found was a toxic atmosphere at workplace.
That sounds like the UN, full stop.
It probably is. I mean, the ICC. I want to say I'm not the best salesperson for the ICC for the reasons I've just said, but the ICC is hugely important because ça a le mérite d'exister, as they say in French. It is, it's statute. The ICC sets the tone for the world in terms of international justice. Its statute has been transposed into national laws around the world. It promotes best practices. A couple of days ago, they rolled out their policy on slavery. They have policies on sexual crimes. It's a laboratory for how justice should work. It's also many countries, and it also puts pressure on countries. In countries like Guinea, Conakry, and in Colombia, justice has moved forward, at least in part because the ICC was on top of them and said, if you don't do something, we're going to do something. In the case that I was most involved in, the case of the former dictator of Chad, Hissène Habré, who was prosecuted and convicted by an African Union-backed court in Senegal. The African Union was explicitly involved in the case because at the time, a lot of African leaders were being called up before the Hague, and the African Union wanted to show to the world, to the ICC, that African crimes could be prosecuted in Africa. So the ICC is hugely important, whether or not it actually, and the first prosecutor, Luis Moreno Campo, used to say, I'm doing my job when we have no cases because cases are being prosecuted at the national level. And there are, there are around the world. You talked earlier, Ian, about universal jurisdiction. France has about 8 or 9 universal jurisdiction cases. At the moment, I was in Switzerland recently, where the former Minister of the Interior of Gambia was prosecuted and convicted under universal jurisdiction. There are very important cases in Germany against Syrian intelligence officers, mid-level officers for torture. You saw there was a case actually in Guinea I just talked about where the former president Daddy's Camara was prosecuted, Charles Taylor prosecuted, Khmer Rouge prosecuted, Hissène Habré prosecuted, Rios Montt in Guatemala, Fujimori in Peru. So a lot of justice going on in the world, but a lot of it is, but the ICC is probably the most important part of this ecosystem.
It's the odds down. If I may quote myself, because sometimes I say things worth quoting. I remember there was a debate about when John Bolton, someone indignantly told me, he said they should knock down the UN above the 3rd floor.
Yeah.
And I said, well, no, he said above the 28th floor, I think, but
I think
I
so. Knock off
agree.
10th floor. Knock off 10th floor,
He
as I
should
said.
do it from the 3rd floor upwards, because that's the public functions of the UN, and that's the only bit that counts. It's a symbol.
Yeah.
If you look at what the UN does, sometimes you raise your hands in despair, but it's what it stands for, that somewhere there are people who think there's something between God and the Congress. So it's it's another way, and the ICC is that similar point, as you say, it has a symbolic. So we have a dilemma as journalists and as human rights activists. You want to criticize it when it is failing, but you don't want to over-criticize it, because you're denigrating from its importance as a symbol, as a catalyst.
Sure. I mean, I feel that way too. And just now, as I'm talking about but I feel like we have to be um, honest. We have to be lucid. We have to be, um, I mean, the ICC is um, an institution with a lot of flaws, but push comes to shove, you want the idea that that the worst crimes should be prosecuted when they're not prosecuted at home, and the we are at a it's not just the ICC that will suffer by if U.S. sanctions cripple it. It's the entire international system. Many people say that international law is being buried in the rubble of Gaza. Um, what is so interesting today is that the ICC on the one hand, but also the ICJ, the International Court of Justice on the other, have actually stepped up. You see the ICJ in its decisions on the South Africa case, in which they find that there's a plausible case to answer for genocide, and in which they've called on Israel to halt certain military, not to attack Rafah, um, also another case by the ICJ in which it held that in a very important and very sweeping advisory opinion that was joined in again by the American judge, by a large majority of judges, that found that the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories had become illegal and that the settlements were illegal. So you have the institutions now actually functioning, but the states that need to support those institutions are wavering or are objecting.
On a lighter note, one of the funniest commentaries I thought was a Caribbean commentator who said, when I think an American politician said he was going to send the US fleet against the ICC, he said the International Cricket Council is not going to know what hits them.
Right. Well, I mean, the basis for that, of course, is that under the Bolton-Bush jihad against the International Criminal Court, the U.S. passed the American Service Members Protection Act, also colloquially known as the Hague Invasion Act, that said that the president, if an American or allied always meaning Israel, is brought up before the ICC, that I think it authorizes the president to go in and go in and I guess attack
previous
them.
presidents had a sanity quotient that we could accept that possibly that wouldn't happen. But we have to be a bit dubious. And moving on from there, because we're getting towards the end, I should advertise that next week we are having Tinitin Japaradze, who is a long-standing Georgian expert, Georgia is very complicated at the moment. Abkhazia is one of the breakaway regions, seems to be trying to break away from its Moscow puppets as well. So it's a very complex situation, and Tinitin is Georgian, so she's been involved in it all of her life, and they will be she will be explaining some of the intricacies of this, And it is very puzzling why they've decided to fight on this part of the Caucasus. But once again, in the ignorance of Republicans, they are fighting for Caucasians. So they're always fighting for Caucasians.
I love it.
Yeah, but that's next week. Please make sure that you come for it. It's one of those areas that it looks as though it's obscure, but it is one of the crossroads of the world. And you know, when I see a small obscure place of which we know nothing, I think Munich, I think Sarajevo. You never know, and the points of principle that are abandoned in these places come back to reverberate down the centuries in all sorts of ways. Now, Reid, you've been extremely good, lucid, and explained it all, and I hope that we can get you back soon to announce the implications of the arrest and incarceration of the people concerned.
That would be pretty amazing.
I agree, but
I need to correct one thing. You said that Kissinger was arrested. He was actually, there was a judge requested requested his appearance, but I don't think he was ever physically. Just for the record, I don't think.
Well, I'm saying arrested in the loosest layman's sense. Yes, I don't think.
But yeah, I mean, these are you know, for people like me who believe in justice, who believe in the idea of even-handed justice, these warrants have the potential to redeem the idea of justice. And the question is it, as I say, is it the beginning, or is this the end, or is this the beginning of a new world? So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving.
Thanks very much, Reid. Thank you very much, everybody. Do check out our forthcoming events, and Georgia is on our mind. Come up for next week. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.